Hello, everybody. My name is Faith. I'm the author of the book Know Your Brain, and I'm the host of the podcast Know Your Brain. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Stuart Ross to our program. And today, he's going to be talking about his book, The Secrets of Psychotherapy. So, hello, Dr. Ross.
Hello, and thanks you for having me on your show.
Okay. So, the first thing I want to ask you is, can you tell everybody about your background?
Um, I've been retired for a few years now. I worked full time in a local psychiatric hospital, the Homewood Health Center here in Guelph, for 37, close to 40 years. And then I also had a part-time private practice for about 7 to 10 years after that. It was very short. And I've been fully retired then for a few years.
Okay. So I just want to clarify for everybody that you're a psychologist, and that you have a PhD in psychology.
Yes.
Can you talk about where you went to school and what kind of studies you did?
I went to a few different universities. I did my undergraduate at Trent University in Peterborough. I did a master's in Queen's University, and then I came back to Toronto for the doctorate. So University of Toronto for the doctorate. An interesting component that kind of leads into the book is that to get your doctorate, you have to do a thesis. And I was offered one that I think was headache management a long time ago. Headache management, you would apply a certain technique to see if you could be effective. And for some reason, and I can't remember, I chose a title that was of interest to me, and it was how much of the therapist's presence should be in the therapy session. In psychoanalysis, the therapist never talks, just the client just talks. But so I was wondering how much of the therapist's life or background or experience could come into a therapy session. For example, at our hospital, we have an addiction center, and the person who started that felt it would be important to hire therapists who had worked their way through an addiction, so they could identify more. So I was wondering, was the therapist part of their life? Is it okay to come in? I've experienced that too, or whatever. So the thesis was called The Self-Disclosing Therapist, and I did a lot of research in that area. And my thesis advisor before the exam said, you have to be able to be really clear in your definition of what self is. And so I defined that from a Western perspective. She said you could be asked about an Eastern perspective too.
Okay.
And so I had to study Eastern perspectives on self. Anyway, I discovered Buddhism at the time. And to make a long story short, as I was studying that, they were saying that the goal in Buddhism, nirvana or enlightenment, was the perfection of psychological health.
Okay.
I just remember that line sticking out. What do you mean perfection of psychological health? Here we are in the West trying to come up with, different therapeutic techniques to improve people's health. I never heard the word perfection used and that stayed with me up until the time that I wrote this book, actually. And then what did they mean by that?
So for your thesis about self-disclosure, what was the finding? What's the value of self-disclosure or the amount of self-disclosure that should happen?
In the West, it was kind of like a little bit. Now, this is, 40, 50 years ago that I did this research. The little bit was okay, but too much was interfering with the therapeutic journey of the client. Now, that was a long time ago. From the Eastern perspective, though, the definition of self, which is one of the so-called secrets in the book, is that it's an illusion.
Okay.
So that was, again, very perplexing reading that stuff way back then.
So it's so interesting that your thesis advisor said you had to define self and the Eastern view versus the Western view. So when you discovered Buddhism, do you feel that you became a Buddhist? Like, do you consider yourself a Buddhist?
Intellectually, the practicality of Buddhism is the practice of meditation, and it's hard, and it's a long journey. The philosophy of Buddhism, though, is very attractive. It's intellectual candy. It's really, really interesting. And so I got very absorbed in all that.
Okay.
It's interesting. The first Buddhist practitioners who came to uh, the America or North America from the Far East were very frustrated with students who, like me, were very interested in the philosophy. But when it came time to practice,
Yeah.
they were not that thorough with that.
Okay. So your book is called The Secrets of Psychotherapy. Um, so I imagine throughout your very long career, you've given a lot of psychotherapy. Was that the main part of your job, giving psychotherapy to clients?
I'm sorry?
How was the main part of your job at Homewood giving psychotherapy?
First of all, when I retired, I was wondering, well, how far has psychotherapy come? Has there been? I mean, I was educated a long time ago, and are there better methods, etc. Um, Prior to actually writing the book, there's a book that we read. I don't know if you can make this out in the camera.
Yeah, Handbook of Psychotherapy and Behavior Change.
Yeah, this was a book that we had to read back in graduate school, and it's a collection. It comes out every 20 years, and they summarize all of the different kinds of therapy that are available. And in that book, there was 500 different kinds of therapy listed, and so I thought, well, what is the best? And there was no best,
Oh,
and that became known as the dodo bird theory, which is from actually Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, the story about the dodo bird who was asked to judge a race. And all the characters in the book they'd fallen out of a boat or something. They all got wet, and so he thought, well, why don't you run around, and the first one who is dried off will be the winner of the race. But he didn't pay attention to the race, who came first, or how fast people went, or where they went, et cetera, et cetera. So at the end of the race, they came up to him. They're all dry by then, and said, which one of us is the winner? And he had to think about it, and not knowing who came first, he said, well, you're all dry now, so you're all winners. You all get a
oh,
prize. And that's kind of the summation of this 20 years study of psychotherapy. Of all these 500 different kinds, there wasn't a best kind. So they called that the dodo bird effect. The difficulty for me, though, was that, for example, if you broke your leg and you went to a hospital and you're in great pain and you said, fix my leg. And they said, well, there's 500 different doctors with 500 different techniques. You have to pick one. And you'd say, well, just give me the best one. And they would say, well, there isn't a best one. So that became, I should back up a little bit. The so-called secrets of psychotherapy are not some kind of hidden agenda by any means. They're just things that the average person wouldn't know about, which began the reason for the book as kind of a consumer's guide to
okay.
psychotherapy. And that's what all of the different chapters are about.
Yeah, and I know are you okay if I share the first secret, secret number one?
Sure.
So secret number one is there's no agreed upon best form of psychotherapy, which is
Yeah.
what you're talking about, the dodo bird
Yeah.
uh, issue. There's no agreed upon best form. So I think when people are looking for a psychotherapist, some of them want mindfulness, some of them want CBT, some of them want dialectical, and maybe they're choosing their practitioner based on the type of therapy they give, which is one thing to do. I mean, how would you recommend people choose their practitioner?
Um, uh, I assume, as I note in the book, that you want someone who has an adequate. I mean, anyone can call himself a therapist. I mean, you could just hang up a shingle and say, I'm a therapist. But hopefully you would want someone who's attached to some sort of college for
Yeah.
regulation, for ethics and things like that. There are specific therapies, though, that I think are better for certain diagnostic categories, for example. Um, Addictions are kind of a funny one because they're really behaviorally based. You have to give up that drug or alcohol, or if you have an eating disorder, you have to learn how to eat in a healthy way. Uh, Starting with psychotherapy for someone with an addiction or an eating disorder is probably not appropriate because it really needs a team approach, uh,
Okay.
similar to PTSD. There are certain, now there's a lot of them, but when I started, there was very few approaches that were specifically garnered because, for PTSD. For example, cognitive therapy was really popular and still is cognitive
Yeah.
behavioral therapy in psychotherapy. But for someone with PTSD, it's not an adequate. It's not fulfill. It doesn't fulfill the healing journey. You can't talk someone out of a traumatic experience. You need something much more inclusive than that. For example, the inclusion of emotion-focused therapies to get somebody to talk about how they feel, as opposed to trying to logically talk, which is cognitive therapy is based on logic. So,
Yeah, I interviewed Dr. Stefanakis recently on one of my other episodes, and he said something similar. He said, if you're dealing with trauma, you have to work on an emotional level. He uses hypnosis for that, and I know EMDR is popular. So let's talk about the book.
okay.
I have your book. I bought the electronic one. I printed it out. So tell me about the content of the book.
I broke it down or separated into four different chapters. The first was those secrets, things like there's no best therapy. One of the surprising secrets that really stands out for me is kind of getting back to that dodo bird effect. In that handbook of psychotherapy, they're thinking if there's 500 different therapies, why would there be that many? There must be some kind of common feature, or why would they even be there if they weren't effective for somebody, uh, whether the therapist or client? Then why would there be a therapy at all? And so there was, in regards to that dodo bird effect I was talking about. There was a really influential bunch of studies done probably 20 years ago, and they said and they expanded upon the dodo bird effect, and they were again looking for that common feature. And what they found is, and it's one of the kind of second so-called secret of the book, is that the outstanding component was the relationship with the therapist, which
Mhm.
was really surprising. And they broke it down into kind of a pie chart. And they said, that the relationship with the therapist is twice as important as the therapy that's being used. So a suggestion for someone looking for a therapist is, if you don't like your therapist, the
Yeah.
chances are if they feel cold or they don't feel understood, probably it's not going to work. The other thing they found was the placebo effect. You know what that is? The sugar
Yes,
pill
yes.
effect was as effective as the therapy itself. In other words, if the therapist truly believed in what they were doing, and the client truly believed that the therapist was good at what they were doing, that could be as effective as the therapy. The other big thing is the problem itself. That took up like 40% of the pie chart, because it's very difficult to compare therapies and clients. Every clients are unique, therapists are unique. The motivation for change. There's all of those variables, which I think really interfered with trying to find the best therapy. It's very difficult to assess the outcome of a therapy. The person's going back into their world. Is that world supportive? Are they with family and loved ones, or is it an abusive relationship? It's very difficult to assess the outcome of a
Yeah.
therapeutic approach.
So I just want to say you have 6 secrets in your book. And the one I really want to ask you about is secret number 3. It says your identity is an illusion. Can you talk about that?
That gets back to that original research I did around self-disclosure. That from a Buddhist perspective, the idea of identity is something that we're not born with an identity. It is something that is a concept. It's conceptual. It shifts. It changes throughout our lives. It's what we think of ourselves as opposed to who we really are, or maybe I should say what we really are. So an identity is something that's put together. I mean, if you really loved in an unconditional way as a child, and you don't have any traumatic experiences when you're growing up, chances are you're going to have a much higher self-esteem than someone who is called a loser or made fun of as a child, and we live with those childhood memories throughout our lives unless they're challenged and changed, which is the bulk of what I've never had anyone come into my office and say, I like myself. Or
Oh,
especially if I say, do you love yourself? No, I don't like myself. So self-esteem is a huge part of what most psychotherapies are about. Again, the importance of that so-called secret is that rather than trying to change a negative belief, such as I'm unlovable, which is very, very common if you're not loved as a child, you carry that with you for your life, which makes adult intimate relationships almost impossible if you believe that about yourself, that you're unlovable. So in a cognitive therapy session, you might want to challenge that belief. Well, where's your proof that that you're unlovable, and is that true and true to? So rather than challenging that belief, which is set in stone, beliefs are like concrete in our minds. Very, very hard to change a belief. Just try to talk someone out of an addiction or an eating disorder for that matter. So from the Eastern perspective, if identity is an illusion, rather than trying to change a negative belief, you using attention, you distract yourself from it, which is
okay.
that's the in the evolution of psychotherapy, mindfulness based cognitive therapy was just a huge breakthrough, because rather than uh, trying to change someone's belief system, you distract yourself from it back into the present moment, which is
Okay.
that was unheard of when
So being able to manipulate and alter your attention. So being able to work with your attention, your scope of attention, your focus of attention, because you could leave that belief, but if you expand your attention, you can then include more beliefs. So yeah, being able to work with attention and mindfulness.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So then as you go through, what comes after, what's next in the book?
So the first, again, that first chapter was around the so-called secrets of psychotherapy. The second chapter, I wanted to give kind of, I'm a very visual person, so I wanted to give kind of a visual overlay, as if, for example, if you went to Europe, there's all those different countries, and they all have different cultures and different languages and different backgrounds, and so I subdivided the major sources or focus of psychotherapy into four major sections, because most psychotherapies would fall into one of these categories. And the first one, I just used attention in and of itself, because that's the essence of mindfulness-based approaches. You know, what are you mindful about? I found seven things that are really the essence of what mindfulness-based therapies are about, that were unheard of when I got my doctorate in psychology. And do you mind if I share those with you?
Sure.
Yeah.
I would love it.
Um, and you may have some thoughts about them. Here's what we didn't know back when I started doing psychotherapy, and the seven uh, parts of mindfulness-based types of therapy were discovered through meditation, discovered through addiction, and really get back to those Buddhist principles that I studied so many years ago. The first is that we can't stop thinking. The mind is on automatic pilot. If you don't believe that, just set a timer and try to focus on your breath and watch what your mind does. It will continuously try to distract you. So
Okay.
that's the idea of using attention, right? To watch. It's kind of like the question we used to ask: who's in control, you or your mind? Now, that sounds like, what, I'm not crazy. What do you mean by that? But again, try to stop thinking, just as an experiment, and you'll see what that's about. You'll also see that the mind works on words and images. And I've tried this experiment many times. You could do it yourself. Just think about one word when you're meditating, and it will take you on what I call a train of awareness that will take you miles away from that word. Almost any word in the mind. The mind is made for problem solving. Emotions are something and different than that, and our physical bodies are as well. So so that automatic thinking will be made up of the fuel of the mind will be words and images. The other thing about the mind is it lives in the past or the future. Those are where our problems are. They're in this exact same moment, this exact moment, we probably have very little, unless you're in chronic pain or something, we have very little to be worried about. But the mind lives in the past and future. It's completely bored with the present. It always wants to be thinking. So in therapy, you'll find people that are regretting the past or fearing the future. They're depressed about their lives, but it's not happening in the moment. And that's that's that Eastern perspective and a real important tenet of mindfulness. The other thing about the mind is it's never satisfied. No matter what we find in life for pleasure, you get a new car or you get a new relationship or whatever it is, that happiness only is temporal. It doesn't last forever. The mind is never satisfied. You can never have enough. If one feels good, you want another one. It's just the nature of our evolution. We're never satisfied. Another important thing that they found is that the mind tries to ignore or get us away from negative thinking. Unfortunately, when you're depressed, the negative thinking can completely take over. So the very thing that we're trying to ignore, like don't think about a pink elephant, and all of a sudden your mind starts thinking about a pink elephant, which is a really big part of depression. It's a spiraling down. You try to get out of it, and it's really sticky. Again, as I said earlier, our beliefs about ourselves are concrete. Our belief systems are concrete. That's the basis of racism, things like that. It's very hard to talk people out of what they believe. So in our mind, we have a belief system about ourselves, about reality that we learn since birth that unless challenged, as I said, is concrete. And the mind can be really mean. It can be a real taskmaster. It's almost like having what they call an inner critic. It's very hard to get rid of as part of what the mind. So those 7 different categories were the basis of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. It's not a perfect therapy. It's not maybe for everything or everyone, but in the evolution of psychotherapies, that's kind of the new kid on the block. In fact, it was so new in the handbook of psychotherapy, they said we haven't had enough time to really judge its effectiveness in regards to other therapies.
So you talked about those 7 characteristics of the mind, and they sound sort of problematic. What is the solution?
The solution is intellectually quite easy, and that is to be able to direct our attention to where we want it to go. And that's why meditation is the kind of essence of mindfulness-based psychotherapy, but the essence of Buddhism too. In other words, if you can, in meditation, if you're just sitting there following your breath for relaxation purposes, that's one thing. But in Buddhism, it's way bigger than that. In Eastern philosophies and in mindfulness as well, it's a way to sit back from your mind in a way. And in meditation classes, I could get people to be able to do that probably within a few weeks. All of a sudden, you realize I'm not my thinking. Thinking is different than me. If that's true, then any thoughts that we have are just thoughts going through our mind, like sounds are going through our ears. That's a huge difference.
There's a writer named Eckhart Tolle, and he says the ego is complete identification with your thoughts and feelings. So it sounds like you're making the person's identity much larger than that, right? Your identification is not just with your thoughts. You are not your thoughts, right? You are, I don't know what you would call it, a spirit or a soul or your heart. I don't know what language you would use to describe it.
That's interesting, because when we become pure attention, in other words, they call that.
Okay, you are pure attention. Okay, you could say that.
When we become, I don't know how, it's hard to describe these experiences, but when we're in that space, kind of stepping back from our mind, that's what we really are. We're a physical entity that has this spotlight of attention, but the mind wants to focus it somewhere. And even if you close your eyes and you try not to think, your mind will continue. It continues while you're sleeping. It's always running. It's really strange when you have that experience sitting back. Okay, I'm focusing on my breath. You will hear your mind in the background as if there's like a radio on or uh, some it's like being in a crowded restaurant
Yeah,
and
or I'll see
you hear all
images.
those voices around you and you're trying to talk to somebody and you have to kind of tune them out. So when you're
Sure.
focused on your breath, the mind doesn't stop. It's really strange. You're sitting there, I'm not thinking, and yet my mind is thinking. It's a strange experience. And then you realize, wait a minute. So everything that I believe is in the mind. It's not me. It's not who I am. And that's what the Buddhists figured out thousands of years ago.
Okay, so chapter 3 of your book is called Psychotherapy East and West. Can you talk about that?
Again, that's the kind of essence of what we've been talking about so far. When I first discovered Buddhism many, many years ago, it wasn't any part of any kind of Western psychotherapeutic psychology. We wanted to be a science. We wanted to be able um, to measure things, like
Yeah.
scientists do, and it's very difficult to do that with the mind. I think maybe 100 years ago or something, when people were discovering, it's not that long ago when you think of the 1800s. It may sound like a lot, but in the evolution of humanity, where people with mental problems were considered possessed by demons.
Yeah, and they thought it was their teeth and they'd pull all their teeth out. You're schizophrenic because you have bad teeth and they'd pull their teeth out.
So
Yeah, just complete guesswork.
it was a huge step for science to divorce itself from religion, because even in my lifetime, I'm sad to it's very sad to admit that just south of here in a small community, there was a young toddler who was drowned in an exorcism. That's within my lifetime, because the people thought the person was it was a really interesting court case. I don't know what happened to it, but they drowned their daughter to try to get rid of this demon inside them. They truly believed that the person was possessed. So we've come a long way when people started saying, no, these back in the 1800s, these aren't demons. They have to be physical somehow. They got to be some kind of intropsychic forces. People did try introspection many, many, many years ago, and but they just said it's not a science. We have to
Mhm.
be able to measure it. So the advent of I'm one of the creators of mindfulness-based psychotherapy, Zendel Siegel. I actually was in Queen's University with him. He was a very strict cognitive therapist back then. Cognitive therapy, they were trying to look for the hot cognition, they called it. That one
Oh,
cognition that was creating, that's the actual term, it was creating depression, it was creating anxiety. If you could get at that cognition and explore that cognition and change that cognition, the person's depression would go away.
okay.
But it didn't. I mean, maybe it was 50% effective. So he was searching for, how can we make cognitive therapy better? Then he discovered this Eastern approach uh, to psychotherapy from someone from the States. And he thought, I wonder if we could incorporate cognitive therapy within that rather than changing people's belief systems. What if we were able to distract them from them? And he used all kinds of different physical techniques as well, yoga, uh, things like that were like yoga. How does that fit into psychotherapy? Here's a cognitive
Yeah.
therapist talking about yoga.
Yeah, but I think incorporating the body into psychological work for some people is very important.
Exactly. I,
Yeah.
I was just talking to a woman recently she suffered seasonal depression. Around this time of year, she gets, like a lot of people get depressed. She uses deep breathing.
Yeah.
That's a purely physical. The breath is been used for forever as a therapeutic technique, such as
Yeah.
mindfulness. Yeah. I mean, there's other like as in that second chapter, I talk about the importance of attention, the people who focus on the mind, emotion focused therapy, uh, which is very interesting, and the physical therapies like art therapy and dance and all kinds of things have been used to help people to increase happiness in their life. I should say emotion focused therapy, that was a huge step in the therapeutic journey. We didn't talk about emotions. When I graduated, I think the only thing I had to, to, to say, if I was asked about emotions, I would say, well, they're impulses to action. That's all I
Yeah.
had to say in my
Okay.
doctoral defense. They're
Yeah.
impulses to action. Okay, let's move on, to
So was the
something else.
focus very much on cognition? Is that what was happening?
Yeah,
And now they've added in emotion, they've added in the body, and they've
there,
added in attention.
there are pure. Well, here's the big discovery for us. Um, when we started our trauma unit in the hospital, when I started in the psychiatric hospital, there was no. The treatment was medication. My job
Okay.
was to assess people, come up with a diagnosis, and then the psychiatrist would administer medications. We had to start thinking differently when other hospitals started offering programs. And anyway, the program that I got attached to was post-traumatic stress. And we realized cognitive therapy is not effective. You can't talk someone out of a trauma. The horrible, horrible, horrible childhoods. Uh,
Because it's too
Trauma
deep.
is so
Yeah.
widespread, it's unbelievable. So we incorporated emotion-focused therapy. So just a quick example. I remember a woman who was depressed and suicidal, and that's a very scary position to be in. Got her to a place where she was no longer suicidal, but she was still depressed. And through exploration, she said, and when someone says to me, I'm depressed, what can I do with that? If I start to ask them 5 different questions, emotion focused questions, it changes everything. What are you angry about? What are you afraid of? What are you sad about? What are you grieving? What do you feel shame or guilt around? And what do you do in your life that is joyful? All of a
Okay.
sudden, everything changes. And those 5 category of actually, we're born with those with 4 categories. Babies could be angry, frustrated. Babies can be afraid. Babies are always can be sad and they can be happy. There's no shame. That's something that's taught
Interesting.
in our lifetimes, guilt and shame, which is quite interesting. So in our program, when someone was really feeling upset, we used this technique called the love letter. Write yourself a love letter, and that's actually from John Gray. He wrote a book called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From
Mhm.
Venus. I don't know, it was a very famous book. He came up with this love letter. It was actually for couples in marital types of therapy to express how they felt. Men are kind of stereotypically thought of as emotionless, or they can't. The studies we did, very few people are able to identify how they feel.
Yeah.
They might say, well, physical, I feel uncomfortable. But
Or
it's
my
very
foot hurts
difficult
or
to
I'm
say.
hungry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very difficult to say. So in a couples therapy, writing each other a love letter, uh, like if someone doesn't come home or they're late or they're insensitive, that really makes me feel angry, and I'm afraid of our relationship, and that was very hurtful. And then I started wondering, is it me? And you don't take me out enough, and those kind of questions were much different than I hate you or we no longer love each other.
Yeah.
You get stuck with those overall
I
categories.
think I think or I hope people are beginning to understand that being able to identify your emotions is one of the keys to mental health. So being able to say, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm afraid, I'm happy, I'm filled with awe, being able to identify at least some basic emotions. And that doesn't come automatically. That's something you learn to do or are taught not to do, right?
That's right. That's right. And I think what you just said is extremely important. As I get into in my the last chapter of the book, parenting and how we're parented can be a huge influence in our lives. I was thinking about emotions when we started to, because it was new for us to talk about emotion focused therapy, and you realize that 2 out of 3 people who go to their doctors are for stress related uh,
Yeah.
problems, right? So
Yep.
if you're not getting along in a relationship, you might have a severe headache, excuse me, or a stomach ache or something like that. And if you go to a physician who's not trained as a psychotherapist and say, I have this pain in my head, they'll give you some kind of medication to relieve that. So the suppression of emotion can have a real, they call it psychosomatics, a huge influence on our physical functioning. Emotions give us energy, and emotions are essential for intimacy. If you can't talk about what's going on, you just get angry and passive aggressive. And that's how I was taught as a child from in my parents' relationship, passive aggression. Oh, I won't talk to you
Oh,
then.
okay. You don't express your anger and work it out. You just sort of, yeah, do things to them. So the last chapter of your book is called A World Without Psychotherapy. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, that's my idealistic. I think and I come up with four different skills that I really feel. I was very impressed when you said that you have mindfulness in your school.
Yep. There's lots of stuff going on in the schools.
Yeah, that was unheard of when I was a child, things like that. But now there's a lot of studies showing the effectiveness of that. Here are four things that I think that I discussed in that chapter, and I call it like a world without psychotherapy. There wouldn't be any need for it, and maybe it'll end wars and things like this. I really believe that parenting skills are important and should be taught in schools. I'm not trying to pile on more information and work for teachers, but I really think that's important. Emotion focused, emotional intelligence, I think is a really important component. Socio emotional skills. I remember some research that was done in around those concepts. Kids who know how to be mindful may be more attentive in class. Marks can go up, et cetera, et cetera. But in solving interpersonal problems, I remember in a class where if a child was acting out, I remember reading about this, uh, that when Billy was acting out and making a bunch of voice, and the teacher would stop the lesson and say, what are we going to do about Billy? And all of a sudden the class would need to solve that problem. Well, how does Billy feel? In one of the classes, the teacher would check in with feelings. You got the pictures of 5 feelings on the blackboard or something. Okay, Billy, how are you feeling today? Well, I'm frustrated. Or kids
Yep.
could learn about their different feelings. In regards to parenting, I remember this study that was done. Is it possible to raise a child without threats and rewards and punishments and all of these kind of behavioral punish focused parental methods, which teach the child I got to obey and be responsible for external reasons rather than taking responsibility for my own actions. Uh, so, as I said, parenting is very an extremely important component of that. The other thing is, I remember seeing someone give a lecture of this a few years ago in our town, and it was a high school superintendent, and he said that we're really lacking teaching kids how to critical thinking, to be able to ask why. And
Okay.
he had a textbook that he put together around that. Um, if kids are just taught things without question, they could become not only resentful, but like those concrete belief systems.
Okay.
Why? What if a children start saying, "Why do people have to go to war?" And really, really explore that. The interesting thing about the word "why" in critical thinking is, no matter what we ask "why" to, we can only come up with a very limited answers to that. I used to play this game with my daughter when she was little, and I'd say, "Let's play the why game," and she'd say, "Okay, why is the grass green?" I go, "I think there's something called chlorophyll in it. Why?" And they say, "Why is the sky blue?" Well, I think it's the reflection of the water in the why. Like no matter what she would ask, you couldn't get beyond a few. So if we can't answer questions such as why do we go to war, then people would start thinking about, again, that's a pretty big question, but people might start thinking about, yeah, why do we?
So I think the last chapter of your book talks about what are some general recommendations that would improve society. So things would generally be better and people wouldn't have so much individual mental illness.
Yeah. So those four different things I talked about, I think that children need to be taught parenting skills when it's an appropriate age.
Okay.
Parenting skills. They need to be taught emotional intelligence so that they can
Okay.
identify how they're feeling. Social emotional, so that they can excuse me, problem solve interpersonal conflict.
What are the other two?
And then the other one was critical thinking skills. I
Okay.
think the four of those would really help, you know, change the world. I really believe that.
Well, I'm glad to tell you that the schools are teaching those things because I work in many, many schools and I have for about 16 years. Um, so your book is called The Secrets of Psychotherapy, an Insider's Report, and you're definitely a very experienced insider with decades of experience, and you can see how psychotherapy has expanded to include more things, how it's really penetrated into the culture broadly, both education and in media. Like, in the 80s, you'd be ashamed to go see a psychotherapist. It would be a secret, and you'd have to be pretty desperate. Now people talk about it openly.
Yeah.
They go on TikTok, they go on YouTube, they look stuff up. They're pretty well informed generally, but always we can help people more to learn more. Can you tell people where they can get the book or where they can contact you?
Yeah. Can I just show the title of or
Sure.
does this show up okay on
Yeah, I can see it.
can you see
Secrets of
it?
Psychotherapy, an Insider's Report. Dr.
Have you figured out why there's three little images of me on the front of the book?
There's you with a puppet and you're cutting the strings.
Yeah. So
Okay.
the figure on the bottom is the me that you're talking to right now.
Yeah.
What you don't see is the puppeteer, which is my mind.
Okay.
That's what's guiding my behavior. Above that is awareness.
Oh, okay.
So it's cutting. If you look really closely at the cover, it's hard to see. It's cutting the strings of the mind over controlling myself. So
So you got the big boss on top there.
that's what it's
So
about.
yeah.
The book is available on at Friesen Press, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about the book.
Okay. So what I'll do is I will put the Friesen Press bookstore link underneath the video. And do you mind if I put your email underneath or you know what? I think they can look at Friesen Press and your email is there already. So if they want to contact you about anything. But I think if anyone in particular is interested in I've read through the book psychotherapy generally, but you have a lot of stuff about Eastern thought and Buddhism and how that has enriched us and brought a lot um, to the practice.
Yeah.
I especially like what you said about some of the things about being sovereign over the self. It was really beautiful. If people are interested in Buddhism, if they're interested in the Eastern influence on psychotherapy, um, I would really recommend your book.
One thing I would say in closing, Faith, is that this is one of 9 books I've written in my life. I've written some earlier books that were more journal focused, more philosophical, and I reread them all recently because I'm doing a series in at the end locally at the end of January about my books, and I found the earlier ones boring.
Okay.
I get halfway through and I think, I don't want to read the rest of this. So when it came to Secrets of Psychotherapy, I tried to make it really open, lots of stories. There's skills in that booklet, psychotherapy skills. So I tried to make it entertaining
Yeah, I
and,
think it's a
and,
very
and,
nice read. Yeah.
and getting rid of big words, things like that. So it's really, hopefully, a consumer's guide
Yeah.
to happiness.
And like you said, there's a lot of exercises in the book. I think it's chapter 2. And I was like, oh, so there's a lot of things if people wanted to practice and try them, they could. So that's
Yeah.
great. Yeah. So, okay. So, thank you so much for joining me. And I hope that people read the book if they have an interest.
Thank you so much for having me, Faith.
All right. So